For him, being conservative means conserving.
The whole idea of us using a thing and then throwing it away and getting another one, I think is affecting all of us as people. We start looking at other people and we say, if they don't give us pleasure, then they are disposable.
And I think it can help but carry over into relationships with people that I'm dissatisfied with this. There's got to be somebody better out there.
I see that a lot in my practice where people will come in and say, well, they met someone at work, or, you know, our relationship started at work, and then eventually we divorced our spouses and we got together. And, you know, once the wrapping was off, then it wasn't as new and different and wonderful as it was in the very beginning when everyone was dressed up and powdered and looked perfect. So they go back to the company and find some other toy to play with.
Our community bonds also suffer. The Salvation Army reports difficulty finding volunteer bell ringers. Participation in civic organizations and activities has been declining over the past 20 years.
All our attention is being pulled in the wrong direction. In trying to run that rat race, we don't have the time to volunteer down at the soup kitchen, to volunteer at church, to go visit the old folks' home, to pay some time and attention to people who need us.
Affluenza affects people across all income barriers. People who have a lot but want more, then feel themselves almost empty inside once they get more. And people who want for life's basics but still find themselves almost taunted by glittering embellishments. And in recent years, the gap between the two groups has been growing. In fact, the gap between rich and poor Americans is now the widest in any industrial nation.
Low-income people see it as an issue of inequity. How is it that I see all these people around me getting wealthier and wealthier, doing better and better, gaining more and more material goods, at a time when I'm falling farther and farther behind?
If you look carefully at the big consumer boom since the 1980s, I think one of the things you'll find is that it's fairly heavily concentrated in the upper part of the middle class and above.
Felicia Edwards didn't share in the boom. She and her two sons live in a tiny apartment in Hartford, Connecticut. Like millions of low-income Americans, Felicia works full-time and then some, but still struggles to provide for her children.
I try to teach them, you know, the dollar is hard to come by. Well, to me it is. Christmas roll around, can you buy me this? But whatever I give them, they're fine with it. They don't ask another question. Zero. Money's not all that important. I mean, we can't buy certain things, but still, we're happy. We're okay with it.
It's Rocco's Modern Life.
Yet Felicia knows her boys frequently feel deprived. Not long ago, one of them begged her for a pair of expensive sneakers.
They were $90. I had to explain to him first that I couldn't afford them, so he wasn't going to get them. But me and his aunt came to a decision that we was going to go half on them, and he got the sneakers.
In our poorest communities, the sense of deprivation is intense.
There was a fellow that I met, and he works with gangs, and I asked him, I said, you know, what's the one thing that you see that's causing a lot of these problems? Without skipping a beat, he said, greed and materialism. He said, these kids, they don't feel like their lives would be worth anything unless they had the hottest product that's being sold in the marketplace.
Soon children throughout the world may feel the same way.
The whole corporate system in the course of globalization is increasingly geared up to bring every country into the consumer society. And there's a very strong emphasis on trying to reach children, to reshape their values from the very beginning, to convince them that progress is defined by what they consume.
Each day, television exposes millions of people in the developing world to the consumer dream, and they are eager to be included. David Corton once believed they could and should. He's worked in Africa, Asia, and Central America for the Harvard Business School, the Ford Foundation, and the Agency for International Development.
My career was focused on training business executives to create the equivalent of our of our high consumption economies in countries throughout the world. Gradually I came to realize that that wasn't working, it couldn't work. Many people's lives were actually worse off, that we were seeing the environment trashed, we were seeing the breakdown of cultures and the social fabric.
1/5 of the world's people live in abject poverty, dying slowly of hunger and disease. Millions of others also desperately need more material goods. Yet were they to consume as much as we do, the result could be an environmental crisis.
There's absolutely no way that everyone in the world can live at that standard of affluence, because the Earth's ecosystem simply will not stand it. Just imagine if every Chinese household had 2 cars.
As this car show in Beijing reveals, they're already on that road. Western products and advertising are pouring into developing countries.
It is creating a groundwork for an incredible global disaster.
Combined with a population explosion not expected to peak for decades, the consumption boom threatens to devour the world's reserves of oil and other resources within the lifetime of our grandchildren. We've set the example.
The American consumer. Each year you consume fantastic amounts of food, clothing, housing, amusements, appliances, and services of all kinds.
Since 1950, Americans alone have used more resources than everyone who ever lived before them. Each of us uses up 20 tons of basic raw materials annually. Only a small fraction gets recycled.
We are ruthlessly cutting down the world's forests, degrading our lands, destroying the climatic systems, all in the quest for money.
We Americans throw away 7 million cars a year, 2 million plastic bottles every hour, enough aluminum cans annually to make 6,000 DC-10 airliners. Our total yearly waste would fill a convoy of garbage trucks long enough to reach halfway to the moon. Our rivers and oceans are already clotted with pollution. Increased emissions of carbon dioxide and other gases accelerate global warming.
Affluenza, that disease of consumerism, is spreading around the world. So it's really critical that we here in North America begin to alter our patterns of consumption and set a better example for the rest of the world of what the good life really is, or none of us are going to have a good life.
According to historian David Shai, the idea that the good life is a simpler, less acquisitive life runs deep in our heritage.
Simplicity is an ancient, even a primordial ideal. The Greeks referred to it as the middle way, that midpoint between luxury and deprivation.
Give me neither poverty nor riches, reads the book of Proverbs. The New Testament is filled with warnings about the dangers of wealth.
So when the Puritans arrived in the New World, one of their major premises was their desire to try to create a Christian commonwealth that practiced simple living.
Waste not, want not, wrote Benjamin Franklin. In colonial America, habits of thrift persisted alongside desires for luxury. Even 19th century Americans still had more respect for thrift than for spendthrifts, and the word consumption meant something different then.
If you go back to Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, to consume meant to exhaust, to pillage, to lay rent, to destroy. In fact, even in our grandparents' generation, when someone had tuberculosis, they called it consumption. So up until this century, to be a consumer was not to be a good thing. It was considered a bad thing.
One of the first harbingers of a change of heart was the department store.
Urban department stores came in during the 1880s, basically, to create the sort of place where people would go and kind of lose themselves and meanwhile spend their money.
By the 1890s, wealthy Americans proudly displayed the material signs of their success. Still, not everyone was impressed.
In the late 19th century, there was another major revival of American interest in simple living. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the foremost proponents of a simpler life for Americans during this period. Roosevelt was quite candid in saying that for all of his support for American capitalism, he feared that if it were allowed to develop unleashed, that it would eventually create a corrupt civilization.
As consumer goods began to roll in large quantities from American assembly lines, labor and religious leaders urged that productive new technologies be used to give people more free time instead of more possessions. But business executives feared a lag in consumer demand might send the whole economy crashing down.